Hey everybody, Edo here, and I am excited because I have Carla Kopp on the line. Say hello, Carla.
Hi, everyone.
And Carla, you run and are designed for, and I guess you've also published things, but with Weird Giraffe Games. I have had the great opportunity of, I think, playing all of these except for the most recent one that's going to be up on Kickstarter, but Super Hack Override, Stellar Leap, Fire in the Library, Dreams of Tomorrow, all of which have gone through Kickstarter. Um, and you have your new games coming out is Big Easy Buskin, right?
Yes, it is.
Awesome. Well, the thing though we're going to be talking about today is other than the first game, you have done the solo mode. I mean, it's just because it didn't have one in all of your titles, right?
Yes.
And we thought it would be fun to talk about designing solo play, right? And what to keep in mind and how to think about it and how to approach it. And you've now done it on quite a number of titles. So just to jump into it, like what are some of the key things that you try to keep in mind with solo design, and when do you start your solo design in your design process?
So I start the solo design after the base game is basically done. Like we're not going to be changing the main player interactions, like how the economy works. Like the multiplayer is done or as done as it can be because there's always these things that you learn later on oh yeah, I should tweak this, but the base game is solid as multiplayer.
And so the base game is solid as multiplayer, and that is also to say that you don't. All the games you've done have been multiplayer first, solo second. You haven't. Have you ever designed any just pure solo games?
Not yet.
Not yet. There's a growing market for them. A lot of people are super interested.
Mhm.
But you're designing, you're working through your game. You have the core mechanics, you have the visualization. You're in that last 20%, last 10% of development, and you're like, okay, now it's time to do solo mode. And when you getting into that solo mode, was it because you really wanted to do solo mode, or is it sort of part of the growing trend of just seeing the number of players interested in solo mode and adding it to the game?
So I didn't initially know that there were solo games, and in my first Kickstarter, I didn't have one. But I had a backer that was really interested in solo, and they asked for a solo mode, and I was like, well, I've never done this before, but I'll try. I actually never did a solo mode for that game, but because they asked, I started looking into it and thinking about it. And at the time, I was also developing Stellar Leap. So I was like, I'll try it out with Stellar Leap and see what happens. And it was actually really fun and easy and just a really different design challenge. Like making a multiplayer game, you have to care about the other people and make sure there's player interaction and everything is balanced. But with solo, you have to make it so that the person is mostly playing on their turn. There's this other player, there's this force out there that they're battling, but it can't take up that much time. It has to really emulate what the multiplayer experience is going to be. It's just a really unique design challenge.
Yeah, and I think you bring up some interesting points in that regard, right? Because I think one number of people now are getting into solo design by virtue of solo players sort of asking slash demanding it, right? You know,
Yeah.
you hear from solo players like you hear from people who want room for sleeves in your inserts, right? And but it's a growing trend, and it's a great market space. And the cool thing about having a solo version in your game is that people can a lot of people will buy the game and then play solo first actually, and then move into before they can get the friends over, they can just sort of play by themselves. And there's a lot of reviewers and outlets that are focused on solo play. But so you sort of dove into it, not having designed any solo before, and sort of not as a solo player yourself.
Hmm.
But I do think you recognize some of the key, one of the key aspects of thinking about solo play is that yeah, maybe you're putting in an AI player and that kind of thing, but you're not crafting a game. Your audience is now different, right? Your audience isn't a group of people; it is a singular person, and thinking about how long they have to wait and all these other aspects, I think, is pretty important. Can you dive in a little bit more into sort of how you think about that? You identified that difference, but how do you start designing towards it?
Well, the first thing I do when I think about the solo mode is try to think about what, like, if you're playing a multiplayer game, there's different strategies. Like, there's an aggressive strategy, there's like passive aggressive usually, and then there's like one where like the other player just follows you around. And you have to kind of think of like what, like, not what the players do, but the effects of like an aggressive player. So you want to boil it down to the effects because you don't want to make a whole other player. Well, like some games do it where it's like, oh, just run two players at the same time and,
Sure.
one will beat the other. But you don't want that. You want to get the effect of having that there and then try to like eliminate all the like upkeep and stuff. Like in Stellar Leap, there's resources. And the AI in that game, it just doesn't have resources. It has enough resources for whatever it does. It gains resources. It's just unlimited because that's not fun. The whole like keeping track of that. So you want to like figure out just like everything you can eliminate so that you get down to the like the really core of what it would be like to play with another player, but not have to do all the thinking.
Yeah, I think you've brought up two important points there. One there is just the table management, right? Like table management isn't fun, and when you're doing table management for somebody else, unless perhaps you're like super alpha gamer, like is not like what is engaging. So having to like score out resources and track a bunch of stuff and manage another player isn't really part of the fun of the game, right? And so I think streamlining that out, like I think your example is great, saying, yeah, this normally this other player would be acquiring resources and managing them and trading them, but like what if they just had unlimited resources? Like they can do whatever they want, and then you think about how to manage it elsewhere, but you've taken that sort of upkeep away from the player, which I think is a big part of really good solo designs. The other thing you brought up too there is that just really thinking about not what are the actions of your opponents in a normal game, but what is the resulting effect or affect or aesthetic of that experience. Like, oh, this is what it feels like when there's an aggressive player. I'm pressured in these ways, or this player is tracking me. And I think those things do bring out, like, it's better to focus on those things than just like your opponent takes the three actions and yada yada yada. Mm. So you've dove in there, and so you've identified that you sort of streamlined the experience, and then you start identifying the different types of play. And then how do you, like, when do you feel like you want to add components? Like, how do you go from like, hey, here's my solo, and I'm just trying to like have a game within the system, to start saying, okay, well now we're gonna add additional rules or change things. Like, how do you sort of take that bit on?
So I try to, like, as I said, get the effects. You play through what would be the effects of the player, and like as you're playtesting, you discover all these different things that need to be changed, like setup things, etc. But like it's really hard to know what needs to be changed for the solo until you actually play the solo.
Oh, sure.
And see how it feels. And like you can take out different things or like change setups. So like, oh, does a robot go first? Does a player go first? It really depends on the robot that you're designing. I tend not to add any extra components because, well, components cost money. But if you can find some way to insert the randomness, like just by identifying, like, I tend to go for like if there's a deck of cards or if there's certain other player cards. So like sometimes like games have it where each player gets this certain setup hand. Well, you're not using that in solo, so you can use it in the solo to inject randomness, hopefully.
For the other for the AI or robot player, you mean?
Yeah, because you don't want the robot player to just do something and you know what it'll do and it'll just keep doing that thing. You want it to be like, oh, okay, I have an idea of what the solo will do, but I'm not sure. It will do like one of these three options, and I have to prepare for all of these three options.
And when it comes to how do you typically, so these games are very different, right? I mean, they're I mean, in some ways, Stellar Leap is, I mean, maybe you feel differently, but the grandest of them. I mean, that was a fairly big game with lots of components, and you had the event cards and the board, and it was like a 4X game. Like there's a lot going on in it in space. Where fire in the library is more of a dice drafting or pulling out. What are those games called? Dice roll.
Bag drawing.
Bag drawing dice.
Yeah.
Something's fun, but like, and then I guess Dream of Tomorrow sort of in the middle where you have a little bit of a board and you have some player interaction, but it's not Stellar Leap, right? It's not like all the way. There's not that much in it. Did you find that with all three of these games? And I haven't played Big Easy Burska, but did you find you had to take that design on for solo differently, or did it basically follow the track that you just mentioned, just with less complexity?
Yeah, it basically just followed the track. Actually, so solo design is really easy for me because well, at that point you have played the game hundreds of times and you try to get the different player like strategies to make sure the game doesn't break. So you know what the strategies are for the game. And then you just list it out, and it's just iteration after that. And the iteration is actually really simple because you need the game and you need you. You don't have to have any other players. You can just sit down and iterate, change over and over.
So one of the interesting challenges I've found with solo, which I haven't designed that many solo experiences, but a number of Pencil First games have had solo modes in it by other designers, is there's the process of development, which I agree with you, I think is expedited because you can just play it by yourself, right? Like it's one of the reasons I think players like it. But the other challenge you run into often is difficulty balancing and difficulty management, right? Because you're probably the best at your game or quite, super informed in all the strategy, but not necessarily like a player who's playing solo mode before they even play the base game. Like, how do you think about difficulty management in your games? Do you just do a sort of a spectrum, or are you what's your process for getting back difficulty in solo?
So usually I make a couple different robots, and as I'm playing them I can kind of see like which one is the easiest one to face, which one is medium and hard, and I kind of do it like that, where like there's like I tell the player like, hey, if you want to start the game on an easy one, go for this one. But I try to make it so that I can't beat it on the first run. Usually it takes me about 3 or 4 plays to like beat the robot, or that's what I want. I don't want to be able to just fight the robot and just defeat it like handily and make it easy. If that happens, I have to go back to the drawing board and be like, okay, so what made this so easy? What made it so that I could just anticipate what the robot was going to do? And I slowly go up from there. There's also been times where it's just like, I can't win with this. So I make like little tweaks and go back to the drawing board. But
Go ahead.
While you're doing that, you can like make a chart of, okay, it was hardest at this way, easiest this way, and so forth. And you can actually include those. Like in Big Easy Busking, there's 3 robots, but there's also levels of difficulty that I was discovering while I was playing. So if you want to go against this certain robot that is the passive-aggressive one, you can do that at easy, medium, or hard.
So in this case, for you've actually created different player types that the player can play against. You're saying when you're saying you've got different player types and then different difficulties at each of those player types. That's interesting. Just to take a second to talk about Big Easy, because I'm not familiar with it. What's the basic game mechanics in there?
So Big Easy Busking, it's an area control game where you're trying to earn the most tips in New Orleans. So you're a busker, and that's a street musician. So the really interesting part about that is you're playing music, and music actually takes time to play. Like, you can't just finish a song on your turn. So there's a number of different crowds, and you are going to choose a song to play at a certain crowd. And everyone's going to do that, and when it gets back to your turn, you can see where everyone's playing, and then you'll actually be able to finish your song. You don't know how much energy or the basically the cubes that they're going to put into each crowd, but you can kind of like tell like, oh, okay, if I'm the only one at this crowd, I can probably win it over. Um,
Sure.
it is actually the game that I've worked on that I just lose. I lose like all the time, mostly because players do like I think like, oh, okay, Nick is gonna play at this crowd, and the ideal thing to do is this, so I'm going to do this, and then he doesn't,
Yeah,
and it
yeah.
just
There are a lot of games when my kid's getting a little older now, but when Evan was 7 or 8, like he would just it wasn't that he was behaving randomly, but like it wasn't against what would be like the expected ideal strategy. So games like Dia Monsters and other things where you're like, he's clearly going to play the 4 now because that would be like the way to win automatically. Oh no, he played the 2. Like, um, but so okay, cool. And so you have the different player types. I guess one of the things I'd be curious about: have you ever tried? So so there are different ways to take on solo. What we've been talking about primarily here is, you said, robots or AI or automation of player behavior and who your opponent is. Have you tried solo modes which sort of translate the mechanics differently from a gameplay experience rather than emulating another player or interaction? Have you tried taking that on?
Yes, actually. So, when I was doing Fire in the Library, I made a robot and I got mixed feedback on it. Some people really liked it, and other people said it gave them anxiety because because it was like just you wanted to beat the robot, but you had to like that's a press your luck game, and they didn't like pressing their luck like that far. So I got that feedback, and I was like, oh, okay, well, the robot, it's good for people who like that extra push to press their luck. Um, but let's make something that's not so anxiety inducing for the people that don't. And I made what I called at the time like the calming variant, where essentially you want to get to a certain score. But I didn't want you to be able to like just play for forever, and like the best way to get the highest score is just to like take your time. That wouldn't really be fun. Well, I
Oh,
mean,
and
it
there's
might
a
be
fire
fun
in the
for
library,
some.
right?
Yeah, there's a fire in the library. You have to save things right now. So with that one, I said you only had 12 turns. Which actually, so there's, in that one, there are turn order cards. And for the solo, I was like, okay, you have all the turn order cards. You get to choose which one you want to do. But for the 12, you can only go through those turn order cards twice.
Right.
And then you're done. The library has collapsed. And that one was fun because you can cause the library to collapse before the 12 turns, and if you do that, you get negative points.
Right. Yeah, we with for a couple examples on the Pencil First Game side, with Herbaceous, the original title, what we ended up doing was Keith Matejka did that design, and rather than sort of doing talking about that, what are the players doing as opposed to actually having that other player there. He changed the mechanics around card draw a little bit, but then there was in Herbaceous you have your own cool pool and a community garden, and that just sort of had a ticker where if there's 5 cards in the community garden, it clears. And that sort of is emulating other people taking what you have, but then it turned into a little bit more of a solo experience in terms of how you take it on, because instead of drawing one for you and one for the group, you did more like Biblios, where you had one for you, one for the group, and one to discard. And so it's playing on those. It's dialing into that push your luck and that pressure from the experience, but not so much where there's another player with another deck that you're playing against. The other interesting one that comes to mind, even more so, is Sunset Over Water, who's Keith Matejka again. That's a game where you're artists competing with each other to collect cards and do all these resources, but rather than sort of taking on that aspect for the solo mode, what Keith did was he basically created refresh cabins and things in the world. So it was much more of a puzzle game where, like, as you were moving through, things were flipping over and replacing, but you were limited in how you could move around this wilderness. And so it became much more about how you're thinking about strategy and when to wake up and what to do, more so than really dying into like, oh, there's other artists out here doing their own thing. Like, so it sort of changed the narrative and aesthetic of the game a little bit, like the what you're feeling as a player, but still dialing into those mechanics. So I think there are some ways to take those things on, and I think your Fire in the Library example is pretty good. Of like, the player base didn't really like the pressure of feeling like they had to push their luck that hard, so we went for this other variant. Now, did you actually release both of them, or did you just do the calming one?
Both.
Okay, and so they were both in there. And so now, generally, you haven't done special components. Has that always been true, or have you done special components in a few cases?
The only special components are really the robot cards, where so Stellar Leap had 3 different robot cards, one for each of the robots. The same thing for Dreams of Tomorrow, where it's just telling you how to play it. I haven't added anything more than here's a few cards, because I don't want you to have to like read from a rule book or like have the rule book open right beside you. Just here's a few cards. You can play the game as is.
Yeah, I think that's generally speaking. Like it's both the component cost, but also just making sure like you're not making it terribly different from the main experience, and that's pretty much in line with all the things we did. One thing that we ended up doing. So the 100 Tour is a game that is coming to Kickstarter on the Pencil First Game side, but basically Scott Caputo did that solo mode, but he had all this player and like there's another player who not so, and you're playing her, and it turned into like those rules you were talking about, like what that player's doing and what's supposed to happen. What we ended up doing was we made like a player board, where it's just like as you're giving her her tiles and doing her stuff, it's just a reminder of how that bonusing works and how just trying to make it so exactly what you said. There's like no rule book referencing and sort of diving in, but more just just an indicator of like what's supposed to happen and keeping that in mind as a player. How do you where do you normally put it in the rules? Do you put it in its own section? Is it first? Is it last? How do you take it when you're actually trying to like build out your rule book? Where do you put the solo rules and stuff?
Right after the in-game scoring for the multiplayer. So the multiplayer is all first, and then once you know like how the game ends, scores, etc., then we go into like the different ways you can play.
Cool. And do you typically also do variants for multiplayer or not so much?
Yes, it depends on the game, but I don't think. Well, yeah, Fire in the Library did, Dreams of Tomorrow does, and so is Big Easy Busking. So, yeah, I guess I am a fan of variants now that you like make me analyze it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like earlier in the chat, well, okay, before I ask that question, are there any other aspects of solo design you think you'd want to highlight or that come to mind?
We went over the different kinds. We went over making difficulties, incorporating components. I kind of talked about like utilizing the components you have, or like trying to find a way to use what you have versus creating new.
Oh, do you typically theme's not the right word, but like when you're working on your solo mode, like do you title your solo mode, do you name the characters, or are you a little bit more like, no, this is just an AI player and here's how they work? Like, is there a sense of characterization of the thing that you're fighting or going against, or have you kept it a little bit more game mechanic-y where you're just like, no, you're playing a solo game and here's the rule set for the cards?
So I typically name the like robot player after the strategy that they do.
Okay.
With Big Easy Busking, I'm gonna go a different route as well. And I'm gonna let the backers name it. So there's gonna be a certain tier where they get to name the band that you are facing because, well, I am really bad at naming. That's like the hardest part of game design for me is when I'm like making up all the cards and it's like, oh, I have to name these 20 cards. This is going to take just as long as like creating all the rest of it is going to be. So instead, I'm going to let the backers do that.
Cool. And do the bands have art, or are they just titles?
They're just titles right now. Like
Got
there's
it.
the Moody Robot, the Following Robot.
Yeah, the we what I've found is that it's nice to name the mode or add that characterization or that little extra to sort of incorporate it into the world to whatever degree you're
Mhm.
incorporating a mode into an abstract game or whatever. But like I do think it adds something to the game, and we've done it better in some places than others. So the other question, the last question I had for you was, you are we sort of talked about solo only or solo first. Are you considering or have you considered doing a solo first game that has multiplayer or not, but actually the first part of the experience is solo?
I have not thought about designing one, but I actually got a pitch for one that I might end up signing later on. Because there is a lot of different things you can do in solo, and a lot of solo gamers out there. So like solo games can do well. It's just I don't think I'll ever design one myself because I like playing games for the people, and it's more of like a way to like interact with people. But I'm not against publishing them like a solo only game.
Cool, cool. Herbaceous was originally supposed to be a solo only game, and then like couldn't get it off the ground. And then I talked to Steve about it, and he was like, "Oh, I don't do solo, but I could do a good multiplayer game." And I was like, "All right, let's do it." and then Keith was like, "I can do your solo mode," and we're like, "Done." So so it worked out. But all right, it was great talking to you about solo games and solo design. You do have a game coming out. When's the Kickstarter? What are the details? A link, or how can people find out about your games?
Okay, so the Kickstarter for Big Easy Busking it starts May 14th, and it'll go till early June. If they want to check it out, they can go to weirddraftgames.com/BEB, or they can just go to straight weirddraftgames.com, and there will be a link there. So I'd really appreciate it if people checked it out, especially if they're interested in solo or street musicians or New Orleans. I mean, it has it all.
Or
And it's
beignets,
kind
right?
of weird. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
But if you want to get me, I'm also on Twitter at Weird Drafts, and we have a Facebook page, Weird Draft Games.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on, and thanks everyone for watching. Bye. Hey everybody, Edo here, and thanks for watching Gaming with Edo. Reviews over here on this playlist, League and Insider videos over here on this one. Subscribe, share, all that good stuff. But most importantly, play some great games. Thanks.